Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name's Chris Leonard. I work at Cactus Communications, and I'm joined today by Mary Miskin, who is Head of Editorial at Emerald Publishing in the UK. And we're here today to talk to you about challenges that authors face when submitting to journals. I'm sure you're aware there are many traps, loopholes and problems you can fall into when submitting your manuscript to academic journals. We're here today to hopefully help you avoid most of those. You can see on your right hand side there is a chat window. If you want to use that while we are presenting, you can ask questions in there and we will hopefully answer them all at the end. There will also be an opportunity right at the end to ask questions as well. But if you have a question and it's something you can't wait for, enter it in there and we'll try to answer it as we go along. So thank you to everyone for signing up and for joining us today. I'm just going to start with a brief snapshot of who Cactus are. We are one of the world's largest providers of specialist English language editing and publication support services for both researchers, publishers, institutions, libraries, and corporations worldwide. And you can see the world map there. And we're all about trying to put the author at the center of things. A lot of services and a lot of processes around an academic's life are designed to make someone else happy and someone else's life easy. We're here to try to reimagine what the world would look like with the author at the center and how their world would change, hopefully for the better, if we think about every interaction they have in their career from their point of view. And that's kind of where we are coming from as well with this webinar today. We want to make authors' lives easier, and to do that, we're going to have a look kind of under the hood of what happens in editorial processes and editorial workflows after you've submitted your manuscript. So I guess one of the first questions to ask is, why do we publish at all? Why do we put ourselves through the pain and the writing and the long weekends and the rewriting and sharing and coordinating with our co-authors, all to get a manuscript which we then send off to a publisher? It's a lot of pain, some of it's quite boring, and so much so you sometimes forget what the upsides are. So some of the motivations to publish your work are around career, improving your career, of course. A lot of that comes through improved networking. When you put your work out there, it is noticed by a lot of people in your field. And of course, any work that you do, any science, any academic research is useless unless we disseminate what the findings of that work was. I mean, if the results stay locked up in your drawer, nobody's going to read them, nobody's going to be able to act on them or to build on them. So it's important, it's an important part of the research process to disseminate your work. Everyone wants to make an impact on the world, but sometimes more specifically, we have requirements for making impact with our research, and the easiest way often to do that is to have your work published in a journal where it will make the most impact. I'm hesitating to use the words impact factor here, but that's a subtext to that. The final two are very soft ones, but I think they are things which are in the back of our minds often when we are writing work. We are clamoring, I guess, for a little bit of respect from our our work colleagues, our scientific and academic colleagues. But ultimately, the reason we are doing the research, the reason we are publishing the research and disseminating it is we want to make the world a better place. And I think that's a very noble ambition. So, Mary, you're on the line there, and you've been very patient while I've been talking. Hi. Shall we move on to the reasons why articles are frequently not published? So here is a very important slide, and I'll perhaps let Mary talk through this one.
Yeah, so this is what Chris and I identified as being, by a long mile, the number one reason why an author does not get a paper published. And that is the simple reason that the journal that you have submitted that paper to is not a good match for your manuscript. This would lead to an immediate desk reject by the editor, and it's a waste of their time, and it's also wasting your time, because as an author, you'll have put a lot of effort into going through that submission process and answering the questions that the journal asks of you through the submission. So for you to put that effort in, and then for an editor to get it at that initial assessment stage, look at the abstract, have a read through, and then see that it's really not relevant for their journal, then you've wasted both their time and your own time. And I think that there's a few things that as an author you can do to avoid that situation. The first is obviously read the aims and scope of the journal that you're planning to submit to, and make sure that they broadly align with the subject of your paper. Also look through the references that you've written within your paper. Are you referencing that journal that you're planning to submit to? If you haven't referenced it, then it's probably a pretty clear sign that that journal might not be the right avenue for you to pursue. There's also increasingly publishers offer services where you can paste in the title and abstract to your paper, and they'll offer a journal matching service using AI to scan through the content of that abstract and suggest suitable journals. For those, you're going to have to choose different publishers to submit to. You're probably not going to find a service that would give you suggestions across a range of publishers, but it would help you to narrow down your options. And also things like reading the table of contents online of the journals that you're planning to submit to, making sure that you're seeing similar work come up in those table of contents to then affirm that the journal you've targeted is looking to be the right area. Those were the thoughts I had on that point, Chris. I don't know if you had anything further to add.
Yeah, I mean, I've also worked behind editorial systems in the past as well. And we often saw a lot of crazily inappropriate articles for a journal. And I think what happens is frequently authors prepare a manuscript without a target journal in mind, and they finish the manuscript and then try to find a home for it. I think some of the best papers I've seen have been targeted for a specific journal, and they were written from scratch with that journal in mind. So I would say if you could identify a target journal and write for that journal, your chances of it being rejected are a lot smaller than if you write and then try to find a journal. Okay, let's move on to some of the other reasons. So we've put quite a few reasons on here. We will go through them individually, but one of the other larger reasons for articles to be rejected at a very early stage, maybe a desk reject even, is because of language. Now, this is nothing to do with English native speakers being judgmental about the content. it's often to do with how understandable the paper is for reviewers. If the reviewers can't understand it, then it's never going to pass the review stage. So often you'll see comments for a desk reject which advise editing by a native speaker. Sometimes even after we send it out for review, we get comments back from the reviewers saying something like, this article needs copy editing, or this article is acceptable, the results are interesting, but it needs to be edited. That isn't anything which should stop outstanding results being published. It is something which, if a reviewer isn't sure about a manuscript, if it's a borderline accept or revise, or if it's a borderline revise or reject, it might make them think, okay, we'll reject this, or we'll advise for a reject, or we'll advise for a revise instead of an accept. And there are a lot of ways you can try to get around this now. There are AI tools online which could help you with language and grammar and spelling. Even if you run your manuscript through Word, you get some great advice for grammar and for spelling as well. You would be amazed at the number of articles we see which are misspelling fairly central terms to a field. So spelling and grammar has often been a problem, but even a cursory improvement of that, like I say, with Word even, that helps. Mary, have you got anything to add in here? Oh, I think we may have lost Mary temporarily.
Sorry, I had forgotten to unmute myself.
Okay, regards language and grammar, any advice?
Yeah. So the main point I want to add, in addition to what you've already said, Chris, is quite often we'll see that authors may have had their manuscript professionally edited prior to submission, but they haven't necessarily also got the abstract section of their manuscript edited. And really, this is the shop window for the paper. This is what editors and reviewers are first reading when they're trying to get a feel for the paper. An editor, especially when they're thinking about that initial reject decision, if they come across a really poorly worded, poor grammar abstract, then they're probably not going to take that step to then also go on and screen the rest of the manuscript. So make sure that the abstract has been edited if you've had to have the rest of the paper edited. And particularly for us at Emerald, I think we have the problem because we ask for a structured abstract, which the authors haven't necessarily prepared that structured abstract when they were preparing the manuscript, and then they come to the submission, see that they need to rephrase that in our structured abstract settings, and then give us a slightly poorer quality where they've had to edit themselves. So just make sure the quality of language is consistent throughout the manuscript. And again, if you're asked to make revisions during the publishing process, once you've made those revisions, if you've had to use language editing, make sure it goes back to that language editor after the revisions have been completed to get that final polish up again.
And something that I haven't mentioned on here in particular, but you'll be familiar with this, Mary. The first time we see a submission in a submission system, we probably get an email with the article title. And then when we log into the submission systems, the first thing we see, again, is the article title. So the article title is also important. It's your first impression on an editor or the editorial office when they're evaluating your article. If it can be kept to be a short description of the manuscript, that's great. Some of the more esoteric and playful titles are not particularly helpful I would say.
Yeah.
I've seen
Yeah.
some crazy ones.
Me
Okay,
too.
so moving on to the next point, which is novelty or advance. So you will see that certain journals are very selective in the kind of content that they want to publish, and they can reject a perfectly well-written article with great language, it's a great match, and you've got a nice succinct title, but they'll say the novelty or advance is too small. Now, that is a very polite way of saying we don't think this is interesting enough. The work is not a sufficiently large step forward in the field. Now, you will probably know what those journals are for your field. If you choose to submit average work there, you're pretty much guaranteed that it will be rejected, maybe even at a desk reject stage for not being a sufficiently large advance. If you have work which is not outstanding and which you know is interesting but not an enormous leap forward in your field, there are other journals you can submit to. And also there are the so-called mega journals, which will publish almost all work as it's been carried out correctly. So again, this is kind of targeting your manuscript to the correct journal. You could, of course, submit everything you write to Nature or Cell, but almost everything you write will get rejected. So try to target your work to the right journal in terms of the content and the scope of the results, as well as the language. Have I got that right, Mary?
I don't think there's an awful lot for me to add to that point, really. I guess just to link into what you're saying, that it may be rejected from one of the seemingly top tier journals, but if you do get a rejection from one title, that doesn't necessarily mean that your manuscript isn't suitable for another outlet. So don't necessarily give up if you potentially you have targeted the wrong place initially. That there could be an alternative journal that is the right place for your content.
Yeah. So the next points, 4 and 5, I'm going to merge up. So structural problems with the manuscript are describing issues where the article's not flowing correctly from one section to another, or you haven't adhered to author guidelines, which are slightly more strict than that. And for certain journals, they can be very specific. So adhering to author guidelines will be things like your abstract needs to be under 250 words. We expect a conflict of interest statement for every author, things like this. Now, not adhering to author guidelines, or the slightly more severe issue of having a structural problem with the manuscript, they are surefire ways to get an immediate reject. Some journals are a lot more relaxed about the format you submit in, and they're happy to review them in that format. And if they pass review, then they will ask you to format according to the journal guidelines. Thankfully, this is starting to become more common, but it's still the vast majority, 90+% of journals expect you to submit according to their author guidelines. So for every submission or resubmission you make to a journal, it's important that you look at what these author guidelines are. So something like abstract length is very easy to measure in Word or your favorite word processing document. There's no real excuse for going over it. And if you do go over it, some editors can be quite severe. So Mary, I don't know what the situation is at Emerald with how strictly you apply author guidelines? I guess it's variable between some titles.
Yeah, it varies between the editor and the title. And what you mentioned there about increasingly the industry is moving to your paper, your way at the initial submission point, which is where we need to get to really, because a lot of the requirements that individual journals do put on authors at that initial submission stage aren't really necessary. At that point, so long as the author has followed the structure that you would expect and followed the referencing style that you would expect. If they haven't gone to the nth degree of exactly placing a full stop where it needs to be an end of a reference to exactly match that author's that journal's author guidelines, then really we need to move to a position where that author isn't being penalised for not having that real intricate depth of following the author guidelines. So I think we're starting to see that shift, but we're definitely not there yet across the industry. Wiley, I know, has started a pilot just before Christmas where they've got a number of journals where they are running this your paper, your way at that point of initial submission, and then just asking the authors to make sure they've followed the guidelines once they've got through to revision stage. So I think as an author, what you need to do is read those guidelines and follow them to the best of your ability, but not necessarily get tied up within the really finer detail of has your referencing list followed specifically the exact guidelines specified. At Emerald, for example, we ask across all of our journals that it's a Harvard style of referencing, but we have our own very specific Emerald style on that Harvard referencing system. And we don't expect that authors has gone through their reference list and formatted it in that way, because even when the manuscripts are accepted, they will go to our typesetting vendors and they'll get run through a black box automation that will transform those references for us. So to be asking the authors to do that when we know it will get fixed through an automated process is an unnecessary burden on them. Sure. So I think my summary would be, yes, follow the author guidelines, make sure that the structure is there, make sure that you've followed the general style of referencing. So if you've used a Chicago style, but the journal wants APA 5th, then you need to change that. But if it wants APA 6th and you've used APA 5th, you know, that kind of differentiation probably isn't a deal breaker.
Great. Okay, thank you. So moving on to number 6 on our list is plagiarism. Now, I'm not sure all authors are aware of this, but nowadays almost every publisher runs almost every manuscript through a plagiarism checker. Now, what this does, it compares the full text of your manuscript with the full text of every published manuscript ever, and it tries to identify sentences, paragraphs, occasionally whole papers, which have just been copied from a previously published article. Now, this technology has only been around for about 10 years or so. So, like I said, not everyone is aware that the publisher has this at their disposal, but the days of being able to copy paragraphs of text from a seminal paper or even from something like Wikipedia are over, because when the article is under review, the publisher will check that for plagiarism, and obviously if the score is over a certain threshold in certain areas of the manuscript, then the article is going to be rejected. So the message to authors has always been, please don't plagiarize. The idea that you could get away with plagiarism is very much outdated, I'm afraid. And there's number 7 on the list is fraud, fudged figures.
Just
and... Sorry, Mary, yeah, plagiarism.
To the plagiarism point, what I would say on that is MERT as a company doesn't routinely run every manuscript through a plagiarism checking software, partly because for some titles we do, but it's not across the board. And that is partly because the software can throw up results that actually, when you investigate the report that you've received, although it looks from the percentage duplication that the report is giving you that there's plagiarized content in there, you actually have to review that quite carefully to then identify that, in fact, it's not necessarily plagiarized content, and it may just be that there's content there that hasn't been referenced in the way you might expect. And the problem that
I'm going to say there are certainly false positives, but there aren't maybe any false negatives. So plagiarized papers won't be able to kind of sneak through, I think.
Yeah, they won't get through, but what I would say is if you had a paper rejected on the basis of plagiarism, because some journals just operate an immediate, okay, if it's reached a certain threshold, this is going to get a desk reject. And as an author, you may want to investigate what's been shown to be plagiarized, because it could be that what the computer is presenting as plagiarism, in fact, is just where those algorithms kind of haven't quite got to the crux of having a human interpret the result that has come out.
Sure, there's a lot of scope for that kind of thing to happen. I've seen articles be flagged up. They haven't been rejected because the editor was aware of the shortcomings of the plagiarism software, but I've seen things get flagged up for author names. So your author name has appeared in other manuscripts, and affiliations and references, but there's a kind of grey area around things like methodologies, which perhaps require a bit of interpretation by editors. So yeah, I would say that there is a chance an article might get flagged up when it hasn't plagiarized, but there's much less of a chance that an article that has been plagiarized would slip through this. The message is what it's always been, which is please don't plagiarize other people's work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So moving on to number 7, which is fraud, fudged figures and dodgy data. This is not something that will probably get you a desk reject. This is probably something which will look fine on first screening and will go out for review. But I used to be on the committee of publication ethics, and even then, which was 10 years ago, we were seeing a large increase in manufactured data points, manipulated images, and simply made up results. Now, like I said, this probably won't be found at the desk screening process. It will be found out almost certainly in the review stage. And then you're in a very tricky situation then, because your name kind of either rightly or wrongly is on everyone's mental blacklist, and you've really destroyed either your chances of making a name for yourself, or you've destroyed the name you have made for yourself. So again, it's the same message that we've had since the start of academic publishing, which is avoid fraud of all kinds. Maybe in the olden days it might have been slightly easier to get away with it, but if you see now some of the forensic image examinations that we have for artwork for journals, you'll know that just rotating a cell line by 90 degrees and photoshopping in another few lines. You might have been able to get away with that, but no more, I'm afraid. I guess you don't have a lot of that kind of problems at Emerald, Mary. I don't know, maybe you do.
Yeah, I mean, we're not publishing in STM, so yeah, we don't have those things like cell image manipulation. We do obviously have examples of dodgy data, fraudulent activities, kind of author or reviewer misrepresentation during the review process, and such figures we'd have in terms of authors trying to pass off other people's images as their own work and copyright. But as you mentioned, this is the sort of thing that might make its way through review, and then when it gets to that accept point and it's examined more closely, these issues would be thrown up and would be investigated. And increasingly, there's the open data mandates, reproducibility expectations, and I think as more and more journals start to mandate that you make your data open, it's going to be much more apparent where there is these problems.
Yeah. So there's an 8th point on here, Mary, which you requested we add.
Yeah.
Could you talk us through that one?
Yeah, so this was just that we quite often see authors will rush their way through the submission process, which can be lengthy and time consuming and burdensome. And they kind of don't pay proper attention to it and can make mistakes during that then can lead to ethical problems later on or lead to delays in the processing of their paper. So, for example, things like when you're listing the authors that have contributed to the paper, you need to list those authors in the order that you want them to be published, and you need to make sure you've included all of your authors. So if you haven't included an author in the first submission and it gets to accept, and you turn around to the publisher and say, oh, actually, John Smith also contributed to this paper, please can we add him in? The publisher is going to say, well, actually, we're going to have to do a full investigation on this because they weren't listed at the outset. There could be something dodgy going on here around gift authorship, that author was potentially missed off during the submission and review, so that a conflict of interest that author might have had with reviewers, for example, is then not identified. So things that could have just been an oversight, an innocent oversight, then become much more complex to try and resolve. There's also an example we ask all of our authors about open access at the point of submission. So do you want to publish this paper open access? Should it be accepted? And again, an awful lot of authors haven't really read or understood that question. Sometimes they don't even really understand still what is meant by open access. And if they say yes to that, it then leads to additional questions at the point of acceptance to pass that manuscript through that workflow. And if you meant no at the outset, you're just adding in delays and more communication that might not necessarily have been needed.
Great, thank you. So having had a fairly in-depth look at 8 of the most major problems authors face when having their work accepted by journals, perhaps we can look on the other side of the fence, which is what are the best practices for this. Now, in some cases, these are the opposite of the worst practices, but not always. So we can't emphasize enough that the scope of your work needs to be a match for the scope of the journal. Okay, this is probably about half of all desk rejects are because the article shouldn't be in that journal anyway. So please use a journal finder. There's a lot of them online. If you're unsure, and submit to the correct journal for that manuscript. Second point, be aware of the ethics of publishing. Mary, is this something you have a lot of trouble with, submitting to more than one journal at any one time?
Yeah, it is something that we see, and on the whole, it tends to be an innocent mistake of authors where they didn't realise that ethically you're not supposed to submit your paper to multiple outlets at one go. The generally agreed rule within the community is you submit to one journal, and then if you're unsuccessful there, then you can think about reformatting and resubmitting elsewhere. But it will, I mean, it doesn't always get picked up on if an author has done this, but it quite often does, because the reviewers, even across different journal titles with different publishers, tend to know one another, and they may find that they've been asked to review a paper in one journal and get the request for that same paper with another journal, immediate red flag, and then the two journals start talking to each other, and both journals are probably going to reject your paper at that point because of the unethical situation that you've placed them in. There's also increasingly the online submission systems are offering duplicate submission detecting software to help publishers identify where this has taken place. As far as I'm aware, at the moment, that software would only recognise duplicates across that publisher's portfolio and not across other publisher portfolios too. But as we start to look at the blockchain for peer review, that kind of software will probably start to help publishers see across the whole spectrum of submissions if there are duplicate submissions from authors.
Okay. And I guess if you're submitting to one journal at a time and the first one isn't accepting your work, you want to resubmit it somewhere else. What do we mean when we say to make the resubmission relevant to the new journal?
So it's the items you've already referred to, I think, Chris, around, is the structure following the same structures of articles in that journal? Have you included in the reference section references to the new journal that you're going to submit to? Have you followed the author guidelines for the new journal? What you need to do is avoid the perception of you're having been rejected from one journal and then submitting to a second choice journal. So let's say the first journal you submitted to was the top tier journal in that area, and it has very specific guidelines of how you format that manuscript. If you just take that straight away and resubmit elsewhere, that journal editor is going to see that they've come to you as a second choice, and know that you haven't put the effort in to want to them. So it's about putting in that effort and making the editors warm to your submission.
Sure. Thanks. And the next few points are fairly straightforward. So we covered language earlier. Is it readable? There are some language checkers online nowadays. If you have easy access to a native English speaker, you can ask them. But it's not that the language has to be perfect. The language just needs to be good enough to be reviewed. And then once it has been reviewed, the editor can decide if it needs to be further refined or not. But things which we can't send out for review because they're unreadable will be sent back immediately. We mentioned some things about the author guidelines earlier, the reference style, the word count. Again, related to point 3, if you're submitting somewhere and then submitting somewhere else with the same manuscript, make sure you've tailored that submission for that journal. Make sure the reference style's right, make sure you're not exceeding any word counts, and then you'll avoid some of the more obvious problems.
Yeah, I think it's also worth pointing out a problem we quite often see with regard to word count is that when the authors had a revise and resubmit decision, once they've completed that revision, they've added more words in and not taken any words out. And at that point, they've gone over the word count. So when you are revising your paper, don't just add, also make sure you're taking away and still coming in under the word count limit.
Yeah, okay. this is something which has become a slight issue, I think, in the last 10, 15 years, which is predatory open access journals. If you're submitting your manuscript somewhere and it's a journal you haven't submitted to before, or indeed haven't heard of before, you owe it to yourself really to do a bit of background research on that journal. So some open access journals pretend to do a review process and then ask you to pay an article processing charge of normally the high hundreds of US dollars. Now, if you've submitted your work on a Monday and they've sent you a accept mail on a Wednesday, you know something probably has not happened there, and that thing will be a review process. So just try to avoid adding fuel to the flame of predatory publishing by not submitting that. There are plenty of legitimate open access journals who would be happy to see your work. So please don't submit to those. And finally, a point Mary asked us to add in, number 7. Do you want to talk us through that?
That should have, this was a very last minute addition to the slides I asked for that this morning. That should actually say revise and resubmit decision, just do it. So this was the point that if you've got through the first round of review and you've had that revise and resubmit decision, we see quite a number of authors drop off at that point and never submit their revision. But if you've got that far and the reviewers have given you feedback and they've said, hey, I'm seeing potential in this, but just make some changes and then it might be suitable, do go away, make those revisions and resubmit the paper, because you're in a really good position. The majority of papers that do get to that stage do then go on to be accepted. So don't just take the paper elsewhere there, carry on with the work and try and get it through to acceptance. And also if you miss the deadline that's been specified in that decision, again, don't just walk away at that point. Get in touch with the editor and ask if you can have an extension. On the whole, they will agree to extensions where required, so don't be afraid to ask.
That's great advice. Thanks, Barry. So just to recap then, even though it's hard and even though it can be a slog sometimes, it is worth remembering why we publish, both for personal reasons and professional reasons, and also to make the world we live in a better place. So there's an opportunity for you now to ask some questions. As we have been talking, we have already had some questions. So Mary and I will attempt to answer these fairly quickly now, and then if we think of a longer, more considered answer, we'll add them in afterwards. So, question number 1, how to avoid plagiarism in referring to an already published paper as a reference. We usually use the same words. So, I think it's important to define what plagiarism is here exactly. So, plagiarism is not using a couple of words. It's not even using the same title within the body of a manuscript to refer to another work. Plagiarism's a more systematic and structured behavior, which is copying large bits of someone else's work, pasting it into your article, maybe altering a couple of words to see if you can avoid plagiarism filters. That doesn't work, by the way. So it's not that you can't use some words that have already been used somewhere else. Of course you can. It's the degree of copying. And even that's acceptable. Perhaps you want to quote someone. If you have that text within quotes in your manuscript and you attribute it to the original source, then that's fine as well. So the best way to avoid plagiarism is to write your manuscript from scratch and refer to work as you require it. Which free plagiarism program do you recommend? There are several out there. I'm sure if you typed in free plagiarism checker into your search engine of choice, you'll find a few. We used to use something called PlagScan, I think it was called. But the issue there is there's an industry standard for plagiarism checking, and it's called Authenticate, and it's expensive and only publishers can afford it. So, yeah.
I mean, a lot of institutions will have institutional accounts, which is Turnitin, which is run by the same company. Although I believe they've been bought by Crossref now. But our point would be really that you shouldn't be having to run your manuscript through a plagiarism checking software. If you're doing it that in the first place, then why do you have that concern? If you've written an original piece of work and you know that you haven't copied and pasted sections from other people's work, then you shouldn't really be needing to run your own manuscript through a plagiarism software checker.
Here. So I actually found a manuscript which had some issues with it, and when I uploaded it to Authenticate, I could see the authors had been using Turnitin at a university in Australia, and over the course of a week they reduced the plagiarism score from 90 to 30 by uploading about 20 different versions, chipping away at the plagiarized text each time until they thought that they'd escaped the plagiarism filter. But of course, it also has a version history of everything as well. So I could see the authors had uploaded 20 versions in a week, and that the first version was 100% copied from somewhere else, and then they just gradually chipped away at it. So yeah, I would echo what Mary says, which is if you feel the need to use a plagiarism detector, then you probably know in your heart of hearts that you have plagiarized something, and that's not really how you should be preparing your manuscripts. Question 3, many journals do not accept for publication those studies that do not present statistically significant findings. Any advice on this? So it depends what you mean by statistically significant. So there's a degree of statistical significance, which some, certainly medical journals require. In things like social sciences, that may not be as strictly enforced, but I would suspect that we mentioned earlier about mega journals, which are happy to publish a lot of work provided it's being carried out correctly, and even if the results are not statistically significant, they may well consider the rest of the work an interesting approach, and they'll be happy to publish it. Sometimes if you have concerns about this, it's worth dropping the editor a line in advance before you go through the whole submission process. You can do a what's called pre-submission inquiry and just say to the editor, look, I've got this manuscript, I think it's interesting, but I've been advised the findings are not statistically significant. Is it worth submitting it to you anyway? And they'll either say yes or no, but it'll be a much quicker way of finding out than submitting through a journal submission system.
I was going to say it's also worth considering the option of submitting a registered report. So there are a number of journals now that offers the option of registering their research methodology and their plans for the study they're going to carry out. And if that's seen as as a potentially novel study, the journal will publish that registered report of what the researchers are planning to do. And then should that research be undertaken and the results are not statistically significant or do not play out to the hypotheses that was first put forward, the results are still guaranteed to be published because the editors have identified that it was a novel research question. So that's one way the industry is moving to try and reduce the kind of positive results bias that you find through the expectation of statistically significant findings.
Thank you. Please guide on what and where to include ethical statement. Mary, is this something you can help on? This isn't really my area.
Yeah, this should be specified in a journal's author guidelines online. So if the journal does require a specific ethical statement, then the guidelines should tell you what you are required to cover within that ethical statement. Depending on whether or not it's a double-blind review journal would influence where you place that, because it could be that your ethics statement could nullify the double-blind status. So usually we would ask for something like that to be uploaded as a separate file that's not intended for peer review. But I would advise you to just check the journal's author guidelines, because they will specify what ethics statements they wish you to include, and it will depend on the subject matter and the research methodology that you've followed.
Great, thanks. I'm just having a quick look down the question list. There's 19 questions, so we might have to skip through some of these a bit quickly or provide quicker answers. So,
okay.
Question 6 says that the publishers provide specific LaTeX or Word template for manuscript preparation. If I don't use these, will the articles get rejected?
Potentially, yes. I would suggest if the publisher has provided you with that template, then use the template.
Whom should I contact for a pre-submission inquiry? So there should be on the journal homepage email address either for the editor or for the editorial office, and you can drop them a quick line, or there'll be a form to fill in on journal homepage where you can submit that pre-submission inquiry. Mary, do you want to do number 8?
Yeah. So this is, what are the documents required during online submission? This is going to vary massively from journal to journal. The very minimum requirement will be that you've got that manuscript file. If it is a double-blind peer-reviewed journal, you need to make sure that any of your author identifying information isn't included in that manuscript. So you would also upload a separate title page that gives the details of who the authors are and what their affiliations are. Some journals will ask for you to upload figures and tables as separate files. Some journals will want it in the manuscript file. But basically, you will need to supply all the documents that a reviewer needs to read that manuscript. There may be additional files that you also supply that can be marked as additional files just for review that you don't want ultimately to be published. So again, it just goes back to reading those author guidelines, which will specify the file types you need to supply when you're going through submission.
Great. How to submit a paper with 2 corresponding authors if the online submission system doesn't allow this? I guess you just have
basically
to use
you
one,
can't. If yeah, the general expectation is that there's just one corresponding author. You would be able to add an acknowledgement on the paper to say both authors contributed equally and can be contacted at, and give the email addresses. But the majority of publisher systems are probably set up to just allow one corresponding author to flow through that system. Okay.
Where can I find email address for sending pre-submission inquiry? On the journal homepage or in the instructions for authors at the start? They might advise a pre-submission inquiry. Why is the status of my paper with editor with a note saying managing guest editor? So I guess this is something to do with special issues, is it, Mary?
Yeah, I would assume that paper's been submitted to a special issue, and it's just specifying that there's a guest editor there that's managing that submission.
Okay. I want to remove my manuscript or withdraw it, I think the term is, as I need to change some of my methodologies. How can I do this ethically?
I would email the editor and explain that you would like to withdraw to make some changes, and they'll have an option on their submission system to be able to withdraw that and send it back to you.
Yeah, sometimes the authors have access to a method to withdraw a manuscript, but it's quite rare because once it's in the review stage, editors don't want you to withdraw it normally. So, I would say exactly what Mary said, and as soon as possible. 13, journal has rejected my paper but wants me to transfer it to another journal internally. What should I do? So this is a process called cascading, right?
Yeah. This will depend on what submission system the author has, but I would expect that if they go into their author center, there should be a call to action button that they can press that will then start that transfer process. But if that's not clear to you, then Google the journal homepage to get hold of the editor contact details, or you probably already have them actually in that reject letter. So just contact an editorial team contact and say you're having difficulties. Can you help?
And if the question is a more wider kind of ethical question, should I transfer it to this other journal within the same publishing house? I guess the answer depends on you. So let's move on.
Yeah, that's up to the author. They could choose
exactly.
to.
Yeah. What's the process for publishing a manuscript in a special issue? So frequently the online submission system handles regular submissions, but you will either see on the first page of the submission system, or when you're selecting article types, the option to submit to the special issue. Sometimes special issues are handled outside of a submission system. If they're expecting it to be a fairly small special issue, you might just be expected to email the manuscript to an external editor. But the process should be fairly clearly laid out in the call for papers for that special issue. Again, if you're having trouble finding what the exact process is, the main journal editor will be able to help, or the main journal editorial office. So the same email that's on the journal homepage where you could send a pre-submission inquiry, you could also ask them about the specifics of an individual special issue. Question 15, Mary, would you like to handle that one?
This seems to be more a statement than a question. It just says, if authors use BibTeX database, for example, for bibliography, that will reduce a lot of bibliography structuring work and can be completely converted to XML PDF without any manual intervention.
So I guess that depends on how the PDF and the XML are created by the publisher in.
Yeah, exactly. That XML might not fit with the publisher's XML schema.
Yeah. Okay. How to identify Scopus index journals with low article processing charges? That's a question for Scopus. I'm not sure you can, is the answer to that anyway. What is the logic to set plagiarism below 20%? Any specific reason? So I think we were talking about this earlier. There is no threshold for plagiarism. And as we said, you could get a very high plagiarism score. And if you look at it, it's perfectly ethical. You know, you might have overlapping references with another article. You might have quoted a piece of work in your article. So it's not that there's a specific threshold for plagiarism. It's more a flag for the editor to say, hey, this article's 50, 60, 70%, maybe we should have a closer look at it. But there isn't any automatic threshold. 18, if I take some data from a published paper which is necessary for my other manuscript, will it be self-plagiarism or is it fine? Phew. So this is, I would call that a gray area. It depends how much data and if you attribute the original source. So let's say you want to publish 3 papers and you're using the same data for each of them. I would argue as long as your interpretation or results are significantly different, that isn't an issue. And as long as you reference the fact that the data was originally published in this article, I think that's fine. Have you got any other views on that, Mary?
Yeah, no, I just agree with what you said, Chris.
Great. And do you recommend to check manuscript in an online plagiarism? Check it before submission? No, because you shouldn't have to, right?
Yeah.
I think we went over that earlier. Right. Well, we are 1 minute over time, so I think we did quite well there. Thank you very much to everyone who logged on today, this afternoon, this morning, evening, wherever you are in the world. We hope you found it useful. Next week, there is a second part to this in which I will be looking at AI solutions to help you avoid some of these problems as well. So until then, thank you very much. And thank you to Mary as well.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, goodbye, everyone.
Bye.